Hey guys, today we're going to be talking with Sarah. On Instagram, you can find her at Equine Apprentice. And she is a good friend of mine, and she was actually just visiting here in Texas with me for a couple weeks. We did some clinics together and trained together for a couple weeks, and we just had a really good time and a lot of conversations while she was here. And I had hoped to record a podcast while she was here, but we didn't get a chance. We were too busy playing with horses. So she's back at her home in Michigan, and I asked her if she would call in and do a podcast recording with me to talk about a topic that is very complicated, but I felt like she was extremely qualified to be able to go through this thought process and talk about why it's so complicated with me, because she does have a lot of hands-on experience, firsthand experience. Oh my gosh, I can't talk today. With horses that have come out of true abuse and neglect cases, horses that are starving to death, horses that are just free breeding, and horses that have horrendous feet. And you can just imagine. I mean, I think at one point the rescue that she was at had 60 horses. So she is not living in La La Land as far as what defines abuse and what it looks like. She actually knows what it looks like. She's seen it. She's seen a lot of it. She's helped a lot of horses through it to get past it, adopted out a lot of horses. So she was very qualified to be able to discuss this with me and you guys. And so I hope you enjoy this podcast. The recording audio might be a little unclear because it is a phone conversation. There's a few moments where it kind of cuts out just a little bit, but hopefully you get the feeling of the conversation and get a bunch to take away, and gives you some thoughts to think on as far as what defines abuse and neglect in horses. Well, hello, Sarah.
Hello.
How are you doing today?
Good. It stopped raining finally, so.
Oh, good. Well, so we had, when you were here in Texas, we had started talking about, I was going to say briefly, but we didn't, so we don't briefly talk about anything. But we had started talking about what the definition of abuse is in animals, particularly horses, since we're both horse people. And I thought this would be something that I would love to discuss with you further, as you have worked for a long time in a very large rescue with many horses that were, by, I guess, law enforcement definition, abused. But we discussed how there's a possibility that there are things that extends past what the law defines as abuse, that would be considered abuse. And then, anyway, so I want to get your thoughts on that. And then also, we talked about that the definition of what is abuse and what isn't is rather subjective. So I just want to let everybody know that while we are having a conversation about what defines abuse to us, this is a subjective conversation, or subjective. The opinions are subjective, and really, just take it all, just think about it, and, add your own thoughts to it and your own opinions to it. This is not a hard and fast definition. This is not what the law defines as abuse, but that's what we're here to talk about. So, any thoughts to get us started on that track?
Oh boy. Yeah, I mean, so we were talking a little bit about how with the law enforcement seizures, there has to be, in order for the law to get involved and take a horse out of someone's custody, there has to be no food, like not even, there can be a hay bale on the property that the horses can't even access, and that is considered food for the horses. So they're either literally no food, no water, or dead horses.
Yeah, I remember when I got Cash and I had to pay for him, the law wouldn't take him. There was water, but it was stagnant, so they couldn't really drink out of it without being very sick. And then there was a hay bale on the property, but it was behind a fence that they could not get to. And there had been a dead horse on the property the week before, but they removed it fast enough.
that nobody saw it. So because law enforcement saw food, saw water, and no dead horses, they would not remove any of the horses, even of a 1 or lower.
Yeah. And unfortunately, a lot of the issue with that is that there's not enough places for horses to go. And so it has to be so bad that there's like, it leaves them with literally no choice, because if we confiscated every horse that, you know, wasn't being taken care of properly, rescues are already completely full.
Yeah.
And so it makes it really tough, because a lot of people will say, you know, when I was working with the rescue, a lot of people would ask, like, you know, there's this horse, it's not really being taken care of. What should I do to get help for it? And unfortunately, people, you know, don't understand why we can't help in those situations, but it's very strict.
Yeah, definitely. And there's just so many horses that are not being cared for, you know, and obviously those standards are subjective, like mentioned, where, you know, what my idea of quality care versus somebody else's quality care might be different. And so it's a very, very gray, fuzzy, fine, you know, it's not even a fine line. There's just, the whole thing is just a gray, fuzzy mess. And so the law draws the line at dead horses, basically. Like, there are animals actively dying. And for the rest of us, it's like, really? We have to wait until there are animals actively dying before we can save them.
Yeah.
But like you mentioned, there's nowhere for them to go. There's nowhere. I mean, what are we supposed to do?
Yeah.
But then, you know, besides the obvious dead horses, you know, starving to death, this is abuse. We were discussing the possibility that abuse extends the physical, as far as you can have a horse that is well fed and well taken care of from outside eyes. So like, they have food, they have water. They may even have like really fancy tack. They may live in a stall, like a really nice barn. But if the horse is suffering mentally or emotionally, or even maybe internally where we can't see it, so maybe the outside they look shiny and pretty, but they're full of ulcers and they have stereotypical behaviors and they're aggressive and dangerous and scared, does that not also qualify as abuse in some way? And this is another very, very gray area, but I wanted to kind of dive into that as far as what defines abuse in, you know, for you personally, as well as for me personally, because I have a lot of people ask me this and I'm like, that is such a loaded question.
Yeah, it's very broad.
It is very broad.
Like, we even started, when you brought that up, we even kind of started, it's like, well, you know, it's kind of this, but it's also this, and maybe this, and this, and wait, it could be this or this.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because for me, I know I don't run a rescue, although I hope to one day have a nonprofit and all that. But, you know, I can see these horses that are quote unquote well taken care of. They're well fed. They're being fed really expensive food and, you know, all this hay and stuff. But if they're being kept in a lifestyle that is not appropriate for their species, so stalled 24/7, being fed high sugar diets, going long periods without hay, being kept in solitary confinement, so without companions, that keeping the horses in that way, to me, qualifies as abuse, because we are no longer supplying the species with adequate accommodations and lifestyle for their needs, and we're subjecting them to an endless, just a chronic level of stress that their body doesn't cope with very well, and comes out in other areas, which typically are behavioral issues. And then what happens when horses has behavioral issues? They start being subjected to a lot of punishment. And so it's this cycle that is not necessarily intentional. I don't think that the humans are intentionally, you know, quote unquote, abusing their horses, but there's the possibility that could fall into a category of abuse if the animal is experiencing trauma by punishment or an inadequate lifestyle for their species. To me, that would qualify as abuse. Maybe there's different grades of abuse, maybe different scaling system. Is the horse actively dying? No. Yeah. Is the horse being fed? Sure. Does the horse have a pretty coat? Yeah, it's getting brushed. But that horse is living in its living nightmare. That's torture to that species.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had one horse who, we often had horses come in where the owner would, surrender the horse or give up the horse because of behavioral issues. And we often eventually came to the conclusion that these behavioral issues were not, it wasn't that the horse was just a bad horse. Like, something was going on in the environment that was causing it. We had one horse who his owner gave him up because he was dangerous. He was exploding and just rearing. She couldn't do anything with him outside of the stall. They said that he was rearing and flipping. And what we eventually learned was that he was being kept in a stall 24/7, being fed 10 pounds of grain a day and getting out once a week to be ridden. And then he was being ridden with a harsh bit and spurs and a whip, and they were like, this horse is crazy. And then he came to the rescue and he was no longer crazy. But to the owner, then it was horrifying to her almost that he was then being kept outside. Like, he was living outside. He wasn't wearing a blanket. He had dirt.
Oh, the horrors.
And to her, that was abuse. She felt like we were not caring for him, even though someone be outside, getting to just do whatever the heck he wanted. He was super calm under saddle. We never had any issues with him. And she felt like she was taking the best care possible with him. And I know that she loved him so much, but she just wasn't able to recognize that the reason that he was having all of those issues was because of his lifestyle and because he wasn't getting turned out.
So it was like an unintentional form of abuse.
Yeah.
I don't really, the word abuse,
it's hard.
It's a harsh word, and it tends to bring up pictures of starving, beaten, bloody horses. They bring up Black Beauty when, in my mind, I'm thinking like Black Beauty when they're running him over rocks and or Ginger, who's just like starving to death and being beaten. And I'm like, that it's such a broad term. And I feel like maybe there's another term that we could use.
Yeah, it's such a big scale.
Yes, there's a huge scale. But at the same time, I would argue, I've seen horses that are filthy dirty, that their manes are just matted and pulling to pieces, and their feet are a little bit overrun, and, they don't have a shelter, let's say, but they're out with their companions and they have forage access all the time, and they're out roaming around and they get to socially interact, and they're not being ridden. And that's, I'll come back to that in a minute, but these horses, they're not being ridden. They don't have a job. They're not being put to work. They don't have a purpose, as according to people. And so they're just these dirty, filthy kind of like pasture ornaments that people are like. And I've seen people openly criticize owners that are like that. And in all honesty, in many of those cases, those horses are probably happier and healthier and much better off than the horses that are being pampered and treated like kings and queens to us. That's the difference, is what's a king and queen treatment to a horse versus what's a king and queen treatment to us. It doesn't matter really what we want or what we think. It has to be according to the species.
Yeah. Well, for a while, I mean, my filly, she every picture of her, she was filthy dirty. She was just, it was a disaster. But she hated being groomed. And we figured out that then, it might have been a combination of she didn't cut, but she also had ulcers, and so that might have made her more sensitive. But she was not groomed for months, and she was filthy dirty. But if I had just forced her to be groomed, that would have been, to her, that would have been worse. She doesn't care that she's dirty.
But it would have been trauma.
Yeah.
You would have put her through trauma to get her groomed, just so she could look good for photos when she doesn't really
She doesn't care at
all. Yeah, and it's, I think probably a better term in a lot of these cases is it neglect or not, versus the term abuse. When we're talking about abuse, tend to, be more about like the starvation and the beating and the, but a lot of these cases, it's more about what defines neglect. Is a dirty horse a neglected horse, or is a horse that is left in its stall 24/7 and ridden once a week neglected? Which one is the worst is worse for the horse? And really, at the end of the day, the horse is the one that tells us. We can't define that. We can't tell the horse, well, it's better for you to be in a stall, whether or not you like it. And they're like, no.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's just such a complex topic.
Yeah. And it can be very subjective, because I was remembering we talked a little bit about my show horse. When I first got my show horse, and when we actually first got this new yearling, she also came from a show barn. They were terrified to be left out at night. To them, being left out in a pasture, even though they had access to, our pastures are set up where they have access to the stalls that they're kept in when it's nighttime. We just don't close the stalls. But to them, if they were not locked in a stall, they were terrified. My horse crashed through the fence because he was so terrified. And so for a while, we had to keep him in a stall at night, because to him, being left outside was abuse. But
that brings up a really excellent point. It's subjective also on the animal side, not just the human side, because, when I say subjective for the human, I'm talking about like for each individual person, what do they define as abuse? But when we're talking about the individual animal, their prior history, their conditioning, the life that they've experienced defines what's traumatic for them and what's not. So this is not just with horses, this is with anything. If you have a puppy that came, let's say, from a puppy mill, or was just really isolated all during its development and never really was socialized around other dogs, and then you just threw him out into a dog park, that would be traumatic and highly abusive to me, in my opinion, because that animal is going through just flooding of, literally, they're being flooded with social interaction, which they're incapable of knowing how to cope with because they've never been prepared for it. And just like when you're talking about your horses that were used to being stalled, you can't just throw them outside and say, good luck, that's how you're supposed to be. That's not it at all. Like, you have to take the individual. That doesn't mean that we should continue to keep them in the stall all the time just because that's what they seem to like. Because we know that for the structure of the horse, the development of them, and their mental and physical well-being, being outside and socializing is better. But if you bring a horse home from a barn that they've been stalled at 24/7 and they have no idea what to do with themselves out in the pasture, you have to be systematic about it and be very cautious and careful and aware of their emotional states.
Yeah.
So that is not a traumatic, abusive situation for them.
Well, and because sometimes that people will say, well, my horse likes to be stalled. They like to be stalled. But, okay, yes, they like to be stalled because that's what's familiar to them. That's what they're used to. Mm-hmm. But we know that it's not as healthy as being outside walking around, and that they typically are they don't get quite as many injuries when they're locked or when they're able to be outside. So do we just say, well, my horse likes being in a stall and leave it at that? Or do we work with them slowly and get them used to what we know is a healthy and eventually will lead to a happier option for them?
Yeah, it's just like you might have a horse that's used to eating a high sugar diet, and maybe they're picky eaters, and you just are like, well, that's not healthy for them, and just cold turkey cutting it off, just taking away that high sugar feed, and then just trying to feed them, let's say, Timothy pellets, like soaked Timothy pellets, or a no sugar feed. They might, if they're a picky eater, might refuse it at first, and then they might go through a long period where they're not eating enough. They might lose weight, and it might be very stressful for them, and it might really negatively impact their gut and their digestive system. So would
I said sugar withdrawal is stressful.
Well, yeah, I've been through that. I know how stressful that is. But so there's that aspect too. So because we know that feeding this high sugar diet is bad for them physically and mentally, do we just say, sorry, horse, no more? Or do we do it in a low stress way that gradually reconditions what they like to eat, how they like to eat, and slowly introduce that healthier food in there? I'm not saying there's going to be, it's going to be all rainbows and butterflies, but we can do it in a way that is not traumatic to them and won't cause other negative side effects. And really, I mean, getting back to, it being such a gray area as far as what defines neglect and abuse and all of that. It's just, I really feel like where am I going with this? I don't even know. It's such a complicated, there's so much, there's no one way to say, well, if you keep your horse in a stall, it's abuse. Well, clearly that's not always the case, because like you just stated, you did have a horse, you keep your horses outside, but clearly this horse, putting them outside was going to be the abuse. So there was this transition stage that needed to happen before you could put them outside. And it would have actually been abuse to turn your horse out, if we're being that picky about what's defined as abuse or not. If we're including trauma into the abuse category, if we're going to add the definite, what's traumatic for the horse mentally, physically, I think a lot of times, sorry, I'm going to go a whole spiel off to the side here, but a lot of times we define abuse as something that's physical. So it's physically abusive, starvation, feeding them, things like that. And we forget about the mental. What's a mental abuse? We're well aware of the fact that this is present in human relationships. You can have a, emotionally or mentally abusive boyfriend or girlfriend. You can have parents that were emotionally abusive to you growing up. But we completely forget about the fact that this can happen with other species. This is not just humans. This can happen to our learners, so our horses or dogs or cats, whatever. If we train them and interact with them in a certain way, we can cause trauma to them. And that falls within the abuse category. If you are caught purposely, or even, there's a whole bunch of, I'm sure you had all these experiences at the rescue area with unintentional neglect that led to the horse being in a bad way, where the owners didn't necessarily think they were doing anything wrong until one day it was like, oh my gosh, what have I done? But that can happen in other areas too, not just the physical, is basically the point I'm getting to. There's a lot of owners, there may be some owners that are intentionally causing trauma to their horses, but there are very few of those in comparison to how many people, including myself way back when, that are unintentionally causing emotional trauma to our horses on a daily basis. And does that fall within the abuse category? Yeah. That's a big question.
Yeah. Well, and then it comes down to as well, how much do you, I don't know, when do you say that, okay, this is abuse and this needs to change, if the horse is being fed and is technically looks well cared.
It could be a lot worse.
Yeah, it could be a lot worse. when do we, like, I don't know, when should there be intervention? Because we don't want to completely ignore that, but at the same time, there's also so many things that are so much worse. I don't know. It's so hard to know. Like, are there things that are like, maybe we should just leave this alone, not mention it, not bring it up? Or, do we need to bring those things up, even though they are a smaller scale? The horse isn't starving to death, but things could be better.
Well, but I don't know that starving to death is that much worse than some forms of mental and emotional abuse that we can put our horses through.
Yeah.
I mean, you can keep a prisoner alive in jail in solitary confinement, and they would rather die.
Well,
Actually, there was an interesting study that was done on pigs, and I'll have to pull it up for reference, where they had pigs that were hungry and also socially deprived, and the pigs intentionally chose social interaction over food when given the choice. After they had spent a period of time being starved and a period of time being socially deprived, they chose social interaction over eating. And obviously I don't want to intentionally put a horse through that study, but there's something to be said for that. Are we so fixated on physical abuse, what we can see, that we forget that emotional, mental abuse is equally as damaging, if not worse in some cases, possibly? But I mean, kind of where I stand for me personally, subjective, but is that the clear, all out, the horse is dying, there are dead animals on the property, that does seem to be a good line for law enforcement. Maybe we could make that better. I think we could do better as far as that goes, but I have no intention of encouraging law enforcement right now, at least, to be policing our interactions with the horses as far as training and stuff like that. That's just not their job. To me, that job falls into the trainers' laps and the show organizations and the FEI and AQHA and the Jockey Club and all of those organizations. They should have a better definition of what's abuse.
And even rescues. I mean, I don't know. Rescues, I think, sometimes don't have high enough standards for the training and what happens after the horse is adopted. I don't know. I mean,
they kind of fall into that same, like as long as the horse isn't being starved and they're having their feet trimmed and they're getting their vaccines, they seem to be okay with it. But to me, if I were to have my ideal nonprofit in the future, and I would hope to also see some other nonprofits be more like this, rescues and such, is they would pay more attention to the training, and they would spend more time on training the horses in a low stress way based on the humane hierarchy, and there would be more education as far as training and behavior modification goes. But that there would be more time also spent training foster homes and potential adopters on how to also work with horses that way, so that the horses were more likely to stay in their homes that they were sent out to. Because I know, and you've told me, and I've heard this from other rescues too, there's a really high return rate for horses.
Which is unfortunate. But it's definitely, part of the high return rate is that when something starts to go wrong, since they have the option to just return the horse, people give up. They give up very quickly. And so they figure, we'll just send them back and let you. It would be nice if we didn't get to that point where something so wrong.
It'd be nice if you cut out a little bit. You cut out a little bit. Say that last part again. You said it'd be nice too.
It would be nice if that, we didn't get to that point where the horse, now something is gotten so bad that the owner feels like they can't fix what's happened, and now they have to send the horse back.
Yeah. It seems like, though, if more time were spent on the training aspect while they were at the rescue, they'd be more likely to stay there with their new homes, one, and then time spent with the adoptees,
Mm-hmm.
adopters, and on the training aspect of it. And then maybe if they're like rescues actually had an active singular trainer, somebody that was working at the rescue that could potentially go out and do follow-up lessons with the doctors. I just feel like so much time and energy is spent on the feeding of the horses and the health aspect of it that the behavioral aspect is just completely missed. And that's what a lot of the horses being returned is about. It's not about the health stuff anymore. It's about the horse acting up, the horse not being rideable, the horse being dangerous on trails, whatever. I'm like, okay, well, the horse is sound and healthy now, but it has zero training.
Well,
or the doctors have zero training.
And that was definitely the biggest issue that we had, was that people were adopting horses that really didn't have very much training, and people kind of felt like, well, I'm gonna train the horse, like, I'm gonna do this, we're gonna figure this out together. And then they would suddenly realize they're like, ah, crap, I just took home a 4-year-old unstarted horse and have no idea what I'm doing.
That just kills me.
But after we kind of switched away from that, and we started spending more time on the training and having the horses more trained before they left, or being a little stricter on who could adopt an unstarted horse, we had very, very few returns after we switched to that, because it was just the home was just a better fit, and the horses had the training and that matched the person's skill level.
Mm-hmm.
But sense. I definitely think that I don't know, training is such a huge aspect of ensuring that a horse stays in a good home, even if they are rehomed. They go to an and the home that they were at was still actively working with them and spent a lot of time working with them. They're more likely to end up staying in good homes. But that's not always followed up on, or like you said, they spend so much time on making sure that the horse is being fed that we kind of forget to think about, is the horse being trained?
And then, you bring in that aspect of, now we have a horse that's transitioning homes over and over and over again. They went from a bad home to the rescue, to a potential adopter, to back to the rescue, to another potential adopter, to back to the rescue. And that in itself can be very traumatic for horses. That transition period is very stressful on them. And we're just, whatever behavioral issues we had before, are likely to be magnified because they're going through so much stress of all those transitions.
Yeah, that was definitely, focusing more on the training, was that horses were being returned with way more issues than they left with. And then we had to fix those issues. So, and then that made it harder on the horse.
Yeah. And, obviously, the doctors and the rescue, and none of you guys or whoever else is out there is intentionally trying to cause trauma to the horse. And they're not, that would be what could potentially fall into, for a very strict definition of, mental, emotional abuse, but unintentionally. But it's not something that you guys, better practices can improve it, but just because of the nature of life and stuff happening, we can't avoid everything. So I ever mean to come across as I'm like, everything's abuse. You can't even look at the horse. Not like that. But I guess the point of what I wanted to talk about in this episode, to wrap it up kind of, is that there is way more. The idea of abuse and neglect is way more complicated than stalling and stalling versus turnout. As far as if you keep a horse in the stall, it's abuse. I mean, I've had people comment on my social media, they see a horse in a stall and they're like, oh my gosh, that's abuse. I'm like, you have no idea what's going on. And I don't, that is an excuse either, because I know people that say, you don't know the full picture, back off. But when I look at the full picture, not that I said anything, but, when I see them comment about to other people, when you do dive into the full picture is that they don't want to pay for a different board, or they're at a training barn and that's just what's there, or, so it's more about the human, it's less about the horse. Whereas in a circumstance like we're talking about with your horses, it was intentionally to reduce stress on the horses. So you were actively making a conscious decision to reduce trauma to the horse. And that would be educated and ethical horsemanship, in my opinion. But back to what the point of the episode is about is it's way more complicated than just the horse is starving or they're not. The horse is injured or they're not. The horse is stalled or they're not. It's so much more complex than that. And we can go down the route of mental versus physical abuse, emotional abuse. What is it healthy and ethical and sound that horses transition homes all the time? Is it good for the horse for us only to be caring about the physical aspect? Are they clean or are they dirty? I mean, there's so much more to it than just it's a skinny horse or it's kept in a stall or you're using a bit. Like, it's so much more complicated than that.
And I think kind of to the point is that it really should just always be a learning experience. Like, we're always trying to learn, what can we do to make this better, to make their life better, mentally and physically.
Absolutely. Because, I mean, you and I both know we've both been down the route of doing things and then later going back and just being like, oh no, what did I do? And learning from those. And it's the act of learning from a mistake that's the important part. Not that I expect anybody to actually be perfect and never make mistakes. That's impossible. At least it is for me. But, it's more about, can we be actively pursuing making better choices for our horses? Can we be actively pursuing listening to our horses and what they're telling us is traumatic or abuse to them versus our definition of it? Our definition doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It's the horse. The horse is the one that can decide what's trauma to them and what's not. I mean, you can look at dirty horses all day long and say, oh, that's abuse. But if the horses don't want to be brushed, I mean, it's not abuse then. Unless obviously your horse has a medical condition and they have to be clean. I'm not going to say every situation, but more complicated stuff. It's the weighing of pros and cons and what does the horse need and what are we working towards, and, their history and the future and all of that. It's enough to give you a headache and a complex. You're just be like, forget it. I'm never going to touch a horse again. Just let them all be feral and wild. No, that's not the answer either. I shouldn't have even brought that up.
That could be abuse.
I don't want to encourage. No, you can go down that route. I mean, horses that are feral and wild, they suffer a lot. I mean, there's a lot of situations where a lot of horses starve to death when they're feral. Their teeth go bad or they get injured and they starve to death. So that's abuse. It's natural. It's nature. They're living a natural life. It's not man-made death. It's not a man-made death, but we shouldn't be so swept up in the romantic appeal of feral and wild to feel like we're doing poorly by keeping horses domestically. I don't think that's the answer either. I think we can have a mutually beneficial relationship in such a way that both parties have a positive experience in a low stress way and enjoy each other's company and benefit from the relationship. I don't know if you agree with me, but I'm sure I feel like you do.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me and flushing all this out. I'm sure my listeners will appreciate to hear from another voice that's not just mine for 43 minutes or something like that. So,
Oh yeah, this was supposed to be what 20?
do you have any final thoughts? Yeah, I told you like 20 or 30 minutes, but you know, I talk. Do you have anything else to add before we close out?
No, I mean, I could probably go on for a few more hours, but I won't.
You and me both. You'll spare us. All right. Well, I'll have to have you back on in the near future, and we'll talk about another very complicated subject. I'm sure that we could talk hours and hours and hours about.
Yeah.
But thank you for talking with me. And till next time.
Thanks so much for listening. If you want to find out more, head to my website, thewillingequine.com. On there, I have a very extensive FAQ page that offers information and answers questions about training in general, as well as my training and services and more information about the Willing Equine. I'm also available on most major platforms, social media platforms that is, such as Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. On my website, there's also a blog. I'm an extremely prolific writer. I love to write. So besides my podcast, that's another way to get access to information that I share. And also feel free to leave feedback. I love to hear from you guys. I want to hear what you think, what you like, what you don't like about the podcast, and any changes you might recommend. So if you are listening through Apple Podcasts, feel free to leave a review through there, or you can contact me through my website or one of those social media platforms. And I look forward to talking to you in future podcast episodes.